When did you realize your own parent was a sociopath? 36 hours after the head-on collision that left my wife paralyzed from the neck down, my mother, I will call her Reagan because I don't see her as my mother anymore, walked into our hospital room and started pushing me to divorce my wife. "I'm only looking out for you," Reagan said, asking if I've ever heard of medical debt, and firing off loaded questions about if I actually thought my wife could get better. As a physical therapist, I knew the answer was yes, but Reagan was a retired nurse who still thought I was a child, so she called every hopeful thing I mentioned emotional delusional. I remember April's eyes were literally following my voice around the room. I pointed that out to Reagan, yet she somehow used that as ammunition. That's just basic reflexes. Everybody with a working brain should know she's got no chance. The not-so-subtle jab at April's damaged brain actually made her cry. And the second I saw tears, I physically pushed Reagan out of the room. Unfortunately, she was back less than 12 hours later, and she didn't come alone this time. She brought her old nursing supervisor, and even a divorce attorney. They tried to sit at my wife's bedside while I was literally moving April's arms, trying to get blood into them. April was crying. Her heart rate was rising to stroke levels, all because Reagan and her band of idiots stood explaining how divorce would be a win-win. Reagan actually walked over to us and started talking over me, borderline screaming at April about how she would be a vegetable forever. "The most loving thing you could do right now," Reagan said, "is free your husband from the burden of taking care of you. He probably doesn't even want to do it anyway." My jaw dropped. But I knew getting angry would only stress April out more, so I resorted to calling a nurse who escorted them out. I went to hospital administration immediately. I laid everything out, yet I was told that Reagan was an experienced nurse who'd worked in this very hospital. That given the circumstances of my wife's condition, Reagan was probably correct, and just a loving mother looking out for her son. Long story short, they'd keep letting her in the room. That night I sat there holding my wife's hand, just reciting our vows and our best memories, when I felt it. Her finger twitched. It was the happiest moment of my life. I literally ran out of the room screaming with joy. And when I came back, I hugged my wife ever so gently as to not hurt her. Sadly, the happiness didn't last. Reagan's next move came before the sun even rose. She was already in the room at 5 a.m., this time with her financial advisor and spreadsheets. I tried to tell her April had literally moved, but she just pointed at the numbers. "You'll drain your savings supporting her. Yeah, she was once your wife, but that woman is now gone. Look at her." She pointed at April. "In 5 years, she'll still be a vegetable and you'll be homeless. Is that what you want?" She gave me an ultimatum there and then. 48 hours, she said, holding up 2 fingers in front of April's face before I slapped her hand away. "You have 2 days to agree to the divorce, or I'll petition for guardianship." She then leaned in and whispered to me, "And if I'm her guardian, I'll just pull the plug. No divorce needed." I clenched my fist, genuinely seconds away from beating Reagan unconscious. Later that evening, I was in the room with April, holding her hand and deep diving on hospital laws and cases like ours. My head was spinning and I was borderline crying, trying to stay strong for April. And that's when it happened. My beautiful wife, when I needed her the most. I felt her thumb on my hand, but not just a twitch this time. April was pressing her thumb into my palm as hard as she could. 1 press, pause, then 4 quick presses, another pause, then 3 more. She was spelling out, "I love you," in the number code we'd made up on our honeymoon. My heart nearly exploded. I remember bawling my eyes out instantly. Nothing else mattered in that moment. I began kissing her hands and face, and despite it being 3 a.m., I felt more energized and alive than ever. I didn't even sleep. I called my lawyer and explained what just happened. I had concrete evidence now. April was getting better, and I was sure there was nothing Reagan could do. What made me even more confident was what happened next morning. April and I were doing our exercises, just passive range of motion on her hand when I felt her push against me. This wasn't just normal muscle tension. This was deliberate, forced resistance she was controlling. My darling April knew that we were getting closer to victory, and this clearly gave her strength. I moved her thumb toward her palm again, and she pushed back again. We could now prove she had voluntary control over her muscles. It felt like everything was coming together. But then Reagan walked in an hour later. She'd heard about the muscle control, and in response, brought in her neurologist friend. He spent 5 minutes checking on April, barely touching her hand. "This is just a reflexive response to stimuli. It's involuntary. Your wife is gone, son," he declared. That's when I snapped. I yelled that they were insane. I turned to Reagan and screamed at her. "What is wrong with you? What kind of mother does this to her son?" Instead of responding, she looked at the neurologist. He had his prescription pad out and was writing. "The husband is exhibiting signs of psychosis. We recommend psychiatric evaluation and immediate removal from the wife's medical decisions." He signed it and handed it to Reagan. Reagan nodded and thanked him, then turned to me. "You have 24 hours left to decide." I watched Reagan walk out, and the second the door closed, I pulled my chair right up against April's bed rail. I wasn't leaving this room for anything. My hand found April's and I squeezed gently, feeling her warmth against my palm. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m. and I knew I wouldn't sleep. I couldn't. Reagan's threat kept playing in my head like a broken record, but I pushed it aside and focused on April's breathing, the steady beep of her monitors, the slight pressure of her thumb against my hand. Around 2 a.m., I felt it again. 1 press. Pause. 4 quick presses. Pause. 3 more. I love you. I squeezed back and whispered that I loved her too, that we were going to fight this together. At 6:03 a.m., my phone buzzed and I grabbed it before the second ring. My lawyer sounded tired but alert, and I explained everything in detail while April's thumb kept pressing reassuringly against my palm every few minutes. He told me to document everything, get witnesses, file formal complaints, and he'd start working on legal options immediately. I thanked him and hung up, then stared at April's hand still resting in mine. That's when I realized I needed to start keeping better records. I found a notebook in my bag and opened it to the first page, writing the date and time at the top. I started logging every single movement April made, every thumb press, every time her fingers twitched, with timestamps down to the minute. I wrote down her heart rate, her blood pressure, her oxygen levels. The night nurse came in around 6:30 a.m. to check vitals, and I showed her what I was doing. She looked at my detailed notes and nodded slowly, then did something I didn't expect. She pulled up April's electronic chart on the computer and started typing, adding her own observations about the coded thumb presses she'd witnessed during her shift. She didn't say much, just gave me a small nod before leaving, but I felt like someone finally believed me. At 6:58 a.m., I heard voices in the hallway and my stomach dropped. Reagan was back and she wasn't alone. I grabbed my phone and opened the voice recording app, hitting record and placing it face down on the table beside April's bed. I also pulled up the patient advocate's number I'd found online and had it ready to dial. Reagan walked in at exactly 7 a.m. with a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as her financial advisor and immediately started spreading spreadsheets across the foot of April's bed. Reagan launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about medical bankruptcy, lifetime care costs, and how I'd lose our house within 2 years. The financial advisor pointed at numbers on his spreadsheets, talking about compound interest on medical debt and asset liquidation. I let them go on for about 3 minutes, documenting everything. Then I calmly held up my phone. I told them everything they were saying was recorded and documented, and that I had the patient advocate's number ready to dial if they didn't leave immediately. Reagan's face went red, but the financial advisor grabbed his papers quickly, and they both walked out without another word. I saved the recording with a timestamp and added it to my documentation log. I walked down to the hospital administration at 7:45 a.m. with my notebook tucked under my arm. The same woman who'd dismissed me yesterday was at her desk, and her expression shifted when she saw me coming. I sat down across from her and opened my notebook, showing her my detailed documentation log with timestamps, witness names, and copies of nursing notes. I explained Reagan's pattern of harassment, her threats to pull the plug if granted guardianship, and her undue influence on April's medical care. The administrator looked uncomfortable as I presented everything, shifting papers around on her desk and avoiding eye contact. She kept emphasizing Reagan's experience as a retired nurse and her history working at this very hospital. She suggested I was emotionally overwhelmed by the situation, and maybe not thinking clearly. I stayed calm and told her I was a licensed physical therapist. I understood medical care, and I was documenting everything for legal purposes. She cleared her throat and said she'd make a note of my concerns, but couldn't restrict family visitation without proper cause. I asked for the proper procedure to request a patient advocate and submit a formal restriction on visitation hours. She reluctantly pulled out some forms and explained I needed to submit everything in writing to the patient advocacy office and risk management. I took the forms and filled them out right there at her desk, citing April's elevated heart rate during Reagan's visits, her visible tears and distress, and the documented pattern of harassment. I listed specific dates and times, attached copies of my documentation log, and included the names of nursing staff who'd witnessed everything. The administrator took the completed forms and said she'd forward them to the appropriate offices, though she didn't sound enthusiastic about it. I asked for copies of everything I'd submitted, and she made them for me, stamping each page with a received date and time. Back in April's room at 9:15 a.m., I set up my phone on a small tripod I'd borrowed from the nurse's station. I positioned it to capture April's face and hands clearly, then started recording. I explained to April what I was doing and asked her to respond to my requests. I said squeeze once for yes, twice for no. I asked if she could hear me and felt one firm squeeze. I asked if she wanted Reagan to keep visiting and felt 2 quick squeezes. I asked if she wanted to stay married to me and felt 1 strong squeeze that made my eyes water. Then I asked her to spell something using our honeymoon code, and she pressed out the numbers for stay, and fight, and love. The day nurse had come in during this and stood quietly by the door, watching everything. I could see her taking notes on her tablet, and when I finished recording, she came over and added her observations to April's official chart without me even asking. At 11:30 a.m., the door opened and Reagan walked in with Lewis right behind her. I stayed in my chair next to April's bed and kept my phone recording in my pocket. Lewis barely looked at April before declaring he needed to perform a neurological assessment. He spent maybe 4 minutes total in the room, touching April's hand twice and watching her fingers for reflexes. I tried to show him my pattern documentation, the video recordings, the nursing notes, but he talked over me. He stated that April's movements were purely reflexive spinal responses, that she had no voluntary motor control, and that I was seeing patterns that didn't exist. I argued that she was spelling out messages in a code only we knew, that she responded correctly to yes/no questions, but he just shook his head. Reagan stood by the door with her arms crossed, watching everything with this satisfied expression. Lewis pulled out his prescription pad and started writing while still standing. He said I was exhibiting signs of denial-based psychosis and an inability to accept medical reality. He wrote that I needed psychiatric evaluation and should be removed from medical decision-making for my wife. He tore off the page and handed it to Reagan, who took it with both hands like it was made of gold. She looked at me and reminded me I now had less than 24 hours left on her ultimatum. They both walked out together, and I heard them talking in the hallway about guardianship petitions and psychiatric holds. I called my lawyer back immediately, hands shaking as I dialed. I explained the psych eval threat and Lewis's recommendation. My lawyer told me to request a patient advocate formally in writing and to notify risk management about attempts to remove me from medical decision-making. He said to draft both letters immediately and send them with read receipts so I'd have proof of delivery. I pulled up my email on my phone and started typing right there in April's room. I wrote to the hospital administration requesting immediate patient advocate assignment, citing the pattern of harassment and threats to my decision-making authority. I attached my documentation log, the recording from this morning, and copies of the nursing notes supporting April's voluntary responses. I sent it with read receipt requested and watched my phone until the confirmation came through. Then I drafted a follow-up letter to risk management detailing everything. I listed Reagan's pattern of harassment starting from 36 hours after the accident. I included her threats to pull the plug if granted guardianship. I described Lewis's cursory examination that took less than 5 minutes and contradicted multiple nursing observations documented in April's official chart. I attached timestamps for every incident, witness names including specific nurses who'd been present, and copies of my complete documentation log showing April's consistent voluntary responses over multiple days. I included the video recording showing April responding correctly to commands and spelling out messages in our personal code. I sent that email with read receipt too, and saved copies of everything to 3 different places. My hands finally stopped shaking, and I sat back down next to April, taking her hand gently in mine. I felt her thumb press once against my palm, and I knew we were going to fight this together, no matter what Reagan tried next. My lawyer called back around 8 p.m., and his voice sounded different this time, more serious and focused. He told me he was referring me to someone who specialized in exactly this kind of case, a disability rights attorney named Giles McCarthy, who handled patient autonomy disputes and family coercion situations. I grabbed a pen and wrote down the number on the back of my documentation notebook, while my lawyer explained that Giles had won cases against family members trying to override spousal decision-making rights. I thanked him and immediately dialed Giles's number, not caring that it was late evening. A man answered on the second ring, and I launched into everything, talking fast and probably not making complete sense at first. Giles stopped me gently and asked me to slow down and start from the beginning, so I did. I explained the accident, April's paralysis, Reagan's visits starting 36 hours after the crash, the divorce attorney she brought, the financial advisor with spreadsheets, the ultimatum. Giles asked specific questions about April's responses, and I described the finger twitches, the thumb presses spelling out our honeymoon code, the voluntary muscle resistance during exercises. He asked what documentation I had, and I read through my entire log with timestamps and witness names. Then he asked about Reagan's exact threats, and I repeated her words about pulling the plug if she got guardianship. Giles was quiet for a moment and then asked if I had that threat recorded or witnessed. I admitted I didn't, that she'd whispered it, but I had everything else documented, including the nursing notes about April's distress during Reagan's visits. He asked about the neurologist's psych evaluation recommendation, and I explained the whole situation with Lewis barely touching April before writing his note. Giles told me to keep documenting everything, not to sign anything Reagan presented, and to call him immediately if she tried to file guardianship papers. We talked for almost an hour, and by the time I hung up, I felt like someone finally understood the seriousness of what was happening. I sat back down next to April and took her hand, whispering that we had help now, that a real attorney who specialized in cases like ours was on our side. Her thumb pressed once against my palm, and I squeezed back gently. I stayed awake watching her breathe, checking the monitors, adjusting her pillows every time the nurses came in for vital checks. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting there half asleep when I felt April's thumb moving against my hand. 1 press, pause, 4 quick presses, pause, 3 presses. I love you. My eyes shot open and I sat up straight, suddenly wide awake. Then she did it again. The exact same pattern, 1, 4, 3. Then a third time, deliberate and clear. But this time the pattern was different. 4 presses, pause, 3 presses, pause, 1 press. Stay. Then again, 1, 4, 3. Love. Then 5 presses, pause, 3 presses, pause, 4 presses, pause, 2 presses. Fight. I started crying so hard I could barely see, but I grabbed my notebook and wrote it all down with shaking hands, documenting each pattern with the exact timestamp from the wall clock. I hit the call button for the nurse, and when she came in, I was still crying, trying to explain what just happened. She looked at my notes and then at April and asked me to have April do it again. I held April's hand, and the nurse watched as April pressed out the patterns again, slower this time, but clear. The nurse wrote everything in her own notes on her tablet, recording the time and the specific patterns. She told me she was adding this to April's official chart as witnessed voluntary communication, and that this was significant progress. After she left, I just sat there holding April's hand and crying, telling her how proud I was, how strong she was, how we were going to beat this together. I didn't sleep at all the rest of the night, just kept holding her hand and feeling those occasional reassuring presses against my palm. When the morning nurse came in for shift change at 7 a.m., I showed her my overnight documentation with all the timestamps and patterns. She read through it carefully, and then pulled up April's chart on the computer, reading the night nurse's notes. She asked if I minded if she added her own observation, and I told her please do. She typed for several minutes and then turned the screen so I could see what she wrote. Patient demonstrates consistent, voluntary, purposeful movement in response to spouse's verbal cues, distinct from reflexive responses. Pattern recognition and communication via established code system indicates preserved cognitive function and intentional motor control. I asked if I could get a printed copy, and she didn't hesitate, just hit print and handed me the page warm from the printer. I folded it carefully and put it in my documentation folder, feeling like I finally had official medical backing for what I'd been trying to tell everyone. My phone rang at exactly noon, and it was Giles calling back. He'd been thinking about our case all night and had a clear action plan ready. First, he'd send a cease and desist letter to Reagan formally demanding she stop the harassment and threats. Second, he'd submit a formal visitor policy restriction request to the hospital, citing the documented pattern of patient distress. Third, he'd request an ethics committee review of the coercion patterns to get institutional backing. Fourth, he'd prepare for an emergency hearing in case Reagan followed through on her guardianship threat. He asked if I was ready to retain him officially, and I said absolutely. He told me he was emailing over a client agreement right then, and I should review and sign it electronically. I pulled up my email on my phone and the agreement was already there. I read through it quickly, saw his fee structure was reasonable and included payment plans, and signed it using my finger on the phone screen. I sent it back within 5 minutes and Giles confirmed receipt, telling me we were officially attorney-client now and everything was privileged. He said he'd start drafting the cease and desist immediately and have it ready to send by end of business day. That afternoon, around 3 p.m., a woman knocked on April's door and introduced herself as Valentina McCarthy, the patient advocate the hospital had assigned to our case. She was probably in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm professional manner that immediately put me at ease. She pulled up a chair and spent the next hour just talking with me, asking about April's accident, Reagan's visits, the pattern of harassment. She reviewed all my documentation carefully, reading through the timeline and the nursing notes and watching the video recordings I'd made. Then she asked if she could observe April's responses herself, and I said of course. Valentina stood next to April's bed and spoke to her directly, introducing herself and explaining she was there to help. She asked April to squeeze once for yes if she could hear and understand, and April's thumb moved clearly against the bed. Valentina asked several more yes-no questions, and April responded correctly to each one. Valentina wrote everything down and then turned back to me, explaining that she'd worked to establish trauma-informed visitation policies that protected April from stress while still respecting family relationships. She said April's stress levels would be monitored during all family visits, and any visitor causing documented distress could be restricted. I felt relief wash over me because someone with actual authority was finally taking this seriously. Before Valentina left, she told me she was recommending an ethics committee consultation to evaluate whether Reagan's behavior constituted coercion versus legitimate family concern about care decisions. She explained the process would take a few days, but would provide institutional backing for visitor restrictions if the pattern was clear. The committee would review all the documentation, interview relevant staff, and possibly speak with Reagan herself. Their recommendations would be binding on the hospital policy, and could be used in court if needed. I thanked her repeatedly, and she squeezed my shoulder, telling me I was doing everything right by documenting and advocating for my wife. After she left, I spent the evening organizing everything into a proper dossier, the kind of thing that could be presented in court. I printed out all my documentation logs and put them in chronological order in a 3-ring binder with tabs. I transferred all the video files to a thumb drive with clear file names and timestamps. I made copies of every nursing note that mentioned April's responses or Reagan's visits. I got written statements from the nurses who'd witnessed April's communication patterns. I created a detailed timeline of Reagan's escalating threats, from the first divorce demand, to the pull-the-plug warning to the psychiatric evaluation recommendation. I emailed everything to Giles, and he called me back an hour later saying this was exactly what we needed if this went to court, that I'd built a case file that would be hard to dispute. The next morning, I was doing passive range of motion exercises with April's arms when someone knocked on the door. A man in a suit walked in holding a manila envelope and asked if I was April's husband. When I said yes, he handed me the envelope and said I'd been served. My hand started shaking as I opened it and pulled out the papers. Petition for emergency guardianship. Reagan's name at the top as petitioner. I skimmed through the pages and felt sick reading her claims. Respondent is mentally unfit to make medical decisions. Patient is in persistent vegetative state with no hope of recovery. Spouse is delusional and refusing to accept medical reality. She described April as brain dead, and me as exhibiting signs of psychosis. The petition requested immediate transfer of all medical decision-making authority to Reagan as guardian, with the power to make end-of-life decisions. I sat down hard in the chair next to April's bed, still holding the papers, my hands shaking so badly I could barely read. I called Giles immediately and he told me to photograph every page and send them to him right away. I did, my hands still trembling as I held the phone steady enough to get clear pictures. Giles called back 10 minutes later and told me not to panic, that we had strong grounds for objection and he was filing it today. He was also requesting a temporary restraining order against Reagan's harassment, attaching our entire documentation dossier and all the nursing staff observations. He'd request an expedited hearing date given the emergency nature of Reagan's claims. He told me to expect a court date within the next week or two, and to keep documenting everything, especially April's continued progress. That afternoon, a hospital social worker came by to conduct a safety and stress assessment, part of the standard protocol when guardianship petitions were filed. She was professional but thorough, asking careful questions about my mental state, my support system, my plans for April's long-term care. I was honest about the stress and the fear and the exhaustion, but I also showed her my organized documentation and explained my professional background as a physical therapist. I walked her through April's progress, showing her the communication patterns and the nursing notes and the video evidence. She observed April responding to my requests and wrote everything down in her assessment. When she left, she told me she'd submit her report to the court, and that based on what she'd observed, I appeared to be a competent and caring spouse acting in my wife's best interests. That afternoon, Valentina came back to April's room with her tablet and a serious look on her face. She pulled up a chair next to me and started explaining that she'd been working on getting a second opinion from someone who actually knew what they were doing. She'd contacted Quentin Espinoza, a neuro-rehab specialist who worked with spinal cord injuries and traumatic brain injuries. He was willing to come do a full evaluation of April's cognitive function and voluntary movement. The appointment was set for 2 days out, but we were waiting on insurance authorization for the consult. I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me, because finally someone was taking this seriously. Valentina told me she'd already submitted the pre-authorization request and marked it urgent given the guardianship petition. She said Quentin was really good at his job, and if April was showing voluntary responses like I'd documented, he'd be able to prove it with standardized tests. I thanked her about 5 times and she just smiled and said this was literally her job. That evening I was sitting in the corner of April's room answering work emails on my phone when my boss called. I'd sent him an email earlier requesting emergency family leave and explaining the situation in very basic terms. He picked up on the second ring and told me the leave was approved immediately, no questions asked. But then he got quiet for a second and warned me that our short-term disability coverage only paid 60% of my salary after the first 2 weeks. I thanked him and tried to sound grateful, which I was, but my brain immediately started doing the math on our savings account. We had maybe 3 months of expenses saved up if I was careful. After that, I had no idea what we'd do. I pushed the thought away and focused on the fact that at least I could be here with April full-time without worrying about losing my job. The next morning, my brother called while I was in the hospital cafeteria grabbing coffee. He sounded worried and confused, asking me what was going on with April and why Reagan was saying I'd lost my mind. I felt my stomach drop because I knew exactly what Reagan was doing. She was calling everyone in our family and April's family, painting me as mentally unstable and claiming I was preventing April from receiving dignified end-of-life care. I spent the next hour sitting at a sticky cafeteria table explaining the actual situation to my brother. I told him about April's voluntary movements, the thumb presses spelling out messages, the way her eyes tracked my voice around the room. I told him about Reagan's threats and her ultimatum and the guardianship petition. He listened quietly and then said he believed me, that Reagan had always been controlling and he wasn't surprised she was pulling this stuff. He promised to call our other siblings and set the record straight. I felt exhausted by the time we hung up, but at least I had one family member on my side. Back in April's room that afternoon, I pulled out the communication board the speech therapist had left on the rolling table. It was a simple laminated sheet with the alphabet arranged in rows. I brought April's hand up to the board and positioned her thumb over the letters. I told her I'd guide her hand across the letters and she should press down when I reached the right one. We started with simple yes or no questions to make sure she understood the system. When I asked if she wanted to stay with me, her thumb pressed down hard on the Y. When I asked if she wanted Reagan to have guardianship, she didn't press on any letter, which I took as a clear no. Then we moved to spelling out actual words. It took almost 20 minutes, but she spelled out YES when I asked if she loved me. The occupational therapist had been standing in the doorway watching, and she came over to document everything in her notes. We did 2 more sessions that afternoon, and April spelled out STAY and LOVE. I wrote down every single letter with timestamps, and the OT signed off on my documentation as a witness. That evening, I checked my email and found a message from Michaela Carson, the hospital ethics committee chair. She was scheduling a multi-party meeting for the following afternoon to review the situation. The email laid out strict ground rules. All participants had to remain civil or they'd be removed from the meeting. Evidence would be reviewed objectively by the committee. Provisional boundaries would be established pending the full committee review. I read the email 3 times to make sure I understood everything correctly. Then I forwarded it to Giles immediately, and he called me back within 10 minutes. He said this was exactly what we needed, that the ethics committee had real power to restrict Reagan's access and protect April from further harassment. He told me to bring all my documentation to the meeting and to stay calm no matter what Reagan said. Later that night, I was lying on the fold-out chair in April's room trying to sleep when my phone buzzed with a new email. It was from Reagan's financial advisor with the subject line, Updated Financial Projections. I opened it and found 3 spreadsheets showing our projected debt over 5 years of caring for April at home. The numbers were huge and scary, showing us losing our house and declaring bankruptcy by year 3. It was clearly sent to pressure me right before the ethics meeting. I felt angry but also kind of relieved because this was more evidence of Reagan's coordinated campaign to coerce me into abandoning my wife. I forwarded the email to Giles with a note explaining the timing, and he responded immediately saying he was adding it to our case file as evidence of continued harassment. The next morning, Giles called with news about the court date. The judge had set a temporary hearing for 1 week out, which gave us a really narrow window for discovery and witness preparation. Giles explained we needed to gather written statements from the nursing staff, who'd witnessed April's voluntary responses, and her distress during Reagan's visits. We also needed to keep documenting April's continued progress with photos and videos. And we had to prepare for Reagan's attorney to argue that I was an unfit decision-maker who couldn't accept medical reality. Giles said he'd start drafting requests for affidavits from the nurses, and he wanted me to keep my documentation log updated every single day. He also said we should expect Reagan's lawyer to subpoena my medical records and work history, looking for anything they could use to paint me as unstable. Quentin Espinoza showed up the next morning right at 9 a.m. He was probably in his mid-50s with gray hair and glasses, carrying a leather bag full of evaluation tools. He introduced himself to me and then to April, speaking directly to her even though she couldn't respond verbally. He explained he was going to do some standardized tests to check her cognitive function and voluntary movement capacity. He spent the next 2 hours working with April, asking her to squeeze his hand on command, follow a pen light with her eyes, and respond to yes or no questions by squeezing once or twice. He was incredibly patient and methodical, giving April plenty of time to process each instruction before moving on. He tested her ability to follow 2-step commands, like squeeze, then release, or look left, then right. He used a stopwatch to measure her response times and wrote everything down in a spiral notebook. When he was done, he told me he'd write up a formal evaluation report within 48 hours, but his preliminary impression was that April definitely had cognitive processing ability and voluntary motor control. That afternoon, I went down to the hospital's medical staff office and filed a formal complaint about Lewis Waite. I wrote out everything that had happened during his visit, how he'd spent less than 5 minutes examining April, how he hadn't performed any standardized cognitive tests, and how he'd recommended my psychiatric evaluation without any proper assessment of my mental state. I attached copies of my documentation showing April's consistent voluntary responses that Lewis had dismissed as reflexes. The staff office administrator took my complaint and said it would be reviewed by the peer review committee. Later that day, Valentina stopped by and told me she was adding her own observations to the complaint file. She said she'd witnessed the boundary violations during Lewis's visit, and his dismissive attitude toward the nursing staff's documented observations. She said the complaint would likely take a few weeks to process, but it was important to have it on record. The insurance case manager called my cell phone that evening while I was doing range of motion exercises with April. She told me April was flagged for transfer to long-term acute care instead of acute rehabilitation. The reason was limited recovery potential based on her current condition. I felt panic rising in my chest because long-term acute care was basically a nursing home for people who weren't expected to improve. I told the case manager about April's voluntary movements and cognitive responses, but she said those observations weren't in the official medical record yet. She gave me 72 hours to file an appeal with supporting documentation. I hung up and immediately started pulling together everything we had. Quentin's preliminary findings, the nursing notes documenting April's responses, my own professional assessment as a physical therapist, and all the video evidence of April following commands. I spent the rest of the night organizing it into a formal appeal packet with a cover letter explaining why April needed acute rehab, not long-term care. The next morning, Valentina showed up with a clipboard and 2 nurses I'd seen on night shift. She explained she was implementing what she called a trauma-informed care protocol for April's room. The nurses would rotate on a consistent schedule, so April would see familiar faces. Visitor traffic would be limited to immediate family only, and all visitors had to check in at the nurses' station first. They set up a log system where they'd track April's heart rate and blood pressure before and after every single visit. Valentina said if anyone caused April's vitals to spike consistently, they'd lose visiting privileges immediately. She looked me straight in the eye when she said it, and I knew she meant Reagan. One of the nurses brought in a small speaker and asked if April liked music. I told her classical was April's favorite, and within 10 minutes, soft piano music filled the room. Valentina scheduled quiet periods twice a day where absolutely no one could interrupt unless it was a medical emergency. She said April needed time to rest without stress, and her brain needed calm to heal properly. I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in days. Someone with actual authority was finally taking this seriously and treating April like a person instead of a lost cause. Quentin arrived that afternoon with a medical student shadowing him and a stack of assessment forms. He pulled a chair up beside April's bed and explained exactly what he was going to do. He said he'd ask her to squeeze his hand, but only on specific numbers. Odd numbers meant squeeze, and even numbers meant don't squeeze. He wanted to see if April could process the instructions and control her response. I stood back against the wall and watched. Quentin held April's hand gently and started calling out numbers in random order. 3. April squeezed. 6. No squeeze. 9. April squeezed. 4. No squeeze. He went through 8 trials total, and April got 7 correct. The one she missed was number 11, and I could see her trying, but her hand was probably just tired. Quentin documented everything on his forms with precise notes about response time and grip strength. He told the medical student this was clear evidence of cognitive processing and voluntary motor control. He said reflexes don't follow complex verbal commands, and they definitely don't show pattern recognition. The student asked if April might just be responding to tone of voice, and Quentin shook his head firmly. He said the randomization and April's accuracy rate proved she was understanding and choosing her responses. He promised he'd have a full written evaluation ready within 24 hours. I met the notary in the hospital lobby the next morning with a folder full of documents Giles had sent over. She was an older woman who'd done hospital notarizations before and didn't seem fazed by the situation. We sat at a small table near the coffee shop and she reviewed each page carefully. I signed papers reaffirming my legal status as April's spouse and medical decision-maker. We had copies of our advance directives that April had filled out 2 years ago when we bought life insurance. She'd written in her own handwriting that she wanted all reasonable rehabilitation efforts if she was ever seriously injured. The notary stamped and signed every page, then made copies for her records. She told me these documents would hold up in any court, and no one could override April's clearly stated wishes without extraordinary evidence. I thanked her and immediately scanned everything on my phone to send to Giles. He replied within minutes saying he was adding them to our court filing, and this was exactly the kind of evidence we needed. The ethics committee meeting happened 2 days later in a windowless conference room on the 3rd floor. Michaela sat at the head of the table with 4 other committee members spread out on either side. I sat on one side with Valentina beside me. Reagan sat across from us with her arms crossed and her face completely blank. Michaela started by explaining the committee had reviewed written complaints about family conflict affecting patient care. She asked me to present my documentation first. I opened my binder and walked them through the timeline of Reagan's visits, April's physical responses, and the nursing observations. I showed them the visitor log Valentina had implemented that clearly showed April's heart rate jumping 20 points every time Reagan entered the room. Valentina added her own observations about the pattern of harassment and the impact on April's medical stability. Then 3 nurses spoke one after another. They described specific incidents with exact dates and times. One nurse talked about April crying during Reagan's divorce speech. Another described finding me physically blocking Reagan from April's bedside. The 3rd nurse read directly from her chart notes about April's elevated vital signs. Reagan sat through all of it without saying a word or changing her expression. When Michaela asked if she wanted to respond, Reagan just said she was concerned about her son's financial future and April's quality of life. Michaela cut her off and said the committee wasn't evaluating care decisions, but rather visitor impact on patient welfare. She announced provisional boundaries effective immediately. Reagan had to schedule visits at least 24 hours in advance. Visits were limited to 30 minutes maximum. A staff member had to be present the entire time. Any violation would result in a complete visitation ban pending full committee review. Reagan showed up unannounced the very next morning. I was doing range of motion exercises with April when I heard raised voices in the hallway. I stepped to the doorway and saw Reagan arguing with the charge nurse about the new visitor policy. The nurse was calmly explaining she needed to leave and reschedule, but Reagan was insisting she had a right to see her daughter-in-law. Security arrived less than 2 minutes later. 2 officers in the hospital uniforms quietly asked Reagan to come with them. She finally turned and walked toward the elevator without looking back at me. I stood there watching until the elevator doors closed. Part of me felt relieved that the system was actually working, but another part of me just felt incredibly sad that my own mother had pushed things this far. I went back into April's room and she was looking toward the door. I told her everything was okay and Reagan was gone. April's eyes moved to meet mine, and I swear I saw something like relief in them. Giles spent the next 2 days tracking down nurses who'd witnessed Reagan's worst behavior. He needed formal affidavits for court, and he wanted statements from people who'd actually documented what happened in real time. The first nurse described the visit where Reagan brought the divorce attorney, and how April's heart rate had climbed to dangerous levels. She included specific vital sign numbers from the monitor and timestamps from her charting. The second nurse wrote about Reagan's financial advisor visit with the spreadsheets and how she'd found me physically shaking with stress afterward. The third affidavit came from the night nurse who'd witnessed April spelling out, "I love you" in our honeymoon code. She described watching April's deliberate thumb presses and how different they were from random muscle spasms. Each affidavit was 3 pages long with professional medical language and 0 emotional commentary. Giles said these were exactly what he needed because they came from neutral healthcare providers with no stake in our family drama. I went back to the medical staff office and filed another formal complaint, but this time specifically about Lewis. I wrote out everything that happened during his visit, how he'd spent less than 5 minutes examining April, how he never did any standardized cognitive tests, how he'd dismissed clear evidence of voluntary movement as reflexes. I cited his recommendation for my psychiatric evaluation when he'd never actually assessed my mental state. I attached copies of my documentation showing April's consistent responses that Lewis had ignored. I included Quentin's preliminary evaluation that directly contradicted Lewis's conclusions. The administrator took my complaint and said it would go to the peer review committee. She explained the process would take a few weeks, but Lewis would be notified and asked to provide his own account. Valentina stopped by that evening and told me she'd added her observations to the complaint file. She said she'd witnessed Lewis's dismissive attitude and his failure to review nursing documentation before making his assessment. I submitted the insurance appeal online with every piece of supporting documentation attached. I wrote a cover letter explaining why April needed acute rehab instead of long-term care. I attached Quentin's evaluation showing her cognitive function and voluntary motor control. I included nursing notes documenting her steady progress over the past week. I added my own professional assessment as a licensed physical therapist, explaining her rehabilitation potential. The whole packet was 47 pages long. I hit submit and got an automatic confirmation email. The case manager called me an hour later and said she'd received everything. She told me the medical review team would need 5 to 7 business days to make a decision. I asked what would happen if they denied the appeal, and she said we could request an expedited external review. I thanked her and hung up feeling like I'd done everything I possibly could. Reagan's attorney sent an email that afternoon with a settlement proposal attached. I opened it on my phone while sitting beside April's bed. The offer said I would agree to an amicable divorce, and in exchange, Reagan would drop her guardianship petition. She'd also set up a trust to cover April's long-term care costs. I read through it twice to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. They were literally trying to buy me off, trying to make me abandon my wife in exchange for not having to fight in court. I called Giles immediately and read him the whole thing. He was quiet for a moment, then asked if I wanted him to send a formal rejection, or just ignore it completely. I told him to reject it in writing and make it clear we would never agree to divorce under any circumstances. He said he'd send the response within the hour. The nursing staff started using yes and no questions to figure out April's preferences. One nurse asked if she wanted music, and April squeezed once for yes. They played different stations until April squeezed twice for no on country music, but once for yes on classical. Another nurse asked about the window blinds, and April indicated she wanted them partially open during the day. The occupational therapist asked about pillow positioning, and April squeezed to show she wanted 2 pillows instead of 1. Every single preference got documented in her chart with notes about how April had communicated her choice. The charge nurse told me this was important evidence that April had preserved cognition and personal agency. She said it proved April was still making decisions about her own care and comfort, even if she couldn't speak or move much yet. I watched them write everything down and felt grateful that these people saw my wife as a whole person, instead of just a patient in a bed. The next morning, Michaela called and asked if I could meet her in a private conference room on the 3rd floor. I told April I'd be back in 30 minutes and kissed her forehead before heading downstairs. Michaela was already there with a folder and a yellow notepad covered in handwritten notes. She gestured for me to sit and explained that the ethics committee looks at patterns of behavior to figure out if family members are actually helping the patient or just pushing their own agenda. She walked me through different scenarios where families had disagreed about care and how the committee decided who was acting in the patient's best interest versus who was being controlling or harmful. I asked her directly if she thought Reagan's behavior counted as coercion, and she paused before answering. She said she couldn't judge the case before the full committee reviewed it, but acknowledged that the documented pattern of threats, harassment, and April's physical stress responses was definitely concerning. She made notes about everything I'd recorded and said the committee would meet within the next week to make recommendations about visitor policies and family involvement in care decisions. I thanked her and went straight back to April's room feeling like someone finally understood what we were dealing with. That afternoon, Giles called and said he was filing a motion to dismiss Reagan's guardianship petition entirely. He'd spent the morning drafting arguments that I was a competent spouse and licensed healthcare professional, that April was showing clear cognitive function through documented responses, and that Reagan's petition was based on outdated information and personal bias against April's condition. The motion included every piece of evidence we'd collected, all the nursing observations, the video recordings of April's voluntary movements, and the timeline of Reagan's escalating threats. Giles said he'd file it electronically within the hour, and the court would have to respond within a few days. I felt this surge of hope that maybe we could stop this whole thing before it even got to a full hearing. But that hope didn't last long because Reagan's attorney sent a response the very next day. I opened the email attachment on my phone and started reading through page after page of accusations that I was neglecting my work responsibilities and our financial obligations. Her lawyer had somehow gotten copies of my leave status from work and our bank statements showing how much we'd spent on medical expenses in just the first week. The response argued that my inability to maintain employment and manage our finances proved I couldn't handle the long-term demands of being April's caregiver. They painted me as this overwhelmed husband who was making emotional decisions instead of practical ones, and suggested that Reagan's guardianship would actually protect April by ensuring stable financial management and realistic care planning. I read it twice and felt sick to my stomach because they were twisting everything to make me look incompetent. I called Giles immediately, and he told me not to panic because we'd anticipated this kind of attack. He said we needed to create a detailed care and budget plan that showed exactly how I would coordinate April's rehabilitation, manage our finances, and eventually return to work with proper support systems in place. I spent the next 2 days putting together the most organized document I'd ever created in my life. I included receipts for every single medical expense with notes about what insurance covered and what we paid out of pocket. I made time logs showing my caregiving schedule hour by hour and how I balanced it with April's therapy sessions and medical appointments. I got a letter from my boss confirming that I could return to work part-time on a flexible schedule once April was stable, and that the company had respite care benefits I could use for backup support. I calculated our monthly budget down to the dollar and showed how we could afford April's care without going bankrupt by using my salary, her disability payments once they kicked in, and the insurance coverage for home health equipment. The whole plan was 30 pages long with tabs and sections and charts showing we'd thought through every possible scenario. Giles reviewed it and said it was exactly what we needed to counter Reagan's financial arguments. While I was finishing the care plan, I got a call from the insurance case manager about our appeal for acute rehabilitation placement. She told me they'd partially approved it and would authorize a 2-week trial period if April met specific criteria during the initial assessment. It wasn't the full approval I'd hoped for, but it was enough to get April into a real rehab program instead of just long-term acute care where she'd basically sit in bed all day. The case manager explained that if April showed progress during those 2 weeks, they'd likely extend the authorization for additional time. I thanked her about 5 times and immediately went to tell April the good news. Her eyes got brighter when I explained it, and I saw her trying to move her thumb against my hand in response. The next day, Quentin came back to do more formal testing with April. This time, he brought a colleague who didn't know anything about April's case or what responses she was supposed to give. Quentin called it a blinded test where he'd ask April to respond to verbal cues, and his colleague would observe and document whether the responses were actually voluntary or just random reflexes. They spent over an hour going through different commands like squeeze once for yes, squeeze twice for no, move your thumb when you hear your name, and hold still when you hear a different name. April got 23 out of 27 trials correct, which Quentin said was 85% accuracy. His colleague was writing everything down and nodding as she watched April respond over and over to the specific commands. When they finished, Quentin told me he'd write a formal report stating that April demonstrates consistent volitional motor control and cognitive processing. He said the report would be ready in 2 days, and I could use it for the guardianship hearing and the insurance authorization. I felt like we were finally building an actual case with real medical evidence instead of just my observations and hope. Giles called that evening and told me the hearing date was set for the following week. I had exactly 3 days to prepare everything and make sure all our witnesses were ready to testify. I spent those 3 days organizing binders with colored tabs for each category of evidence, including medical documentation, nursing observations, video recordings, financial planning, witness statements, and Reagan's threat timeline. I made copies of everything and put them in sheet protectors, so nothing would get damaged or lost. I scheduled the nurses who'd witnessed April's responses and made sure they could take time off work to come testify. I compiled the visitor logs that showed April's heart rate and blood pressure spiking every single time Reagan came into the room and calming down after she left. I created a timeline with dates and times of every threat Reagan had made starting from that first day when she told me to divorce April. Giles came to the hospital the night before the hearing and reviewed every single document with me for 3 hours straight. He asked me practice questions about my caregiving abilities and my professional qualifications and how I plan to manage April's care long term. By the time he left at midnight, I felt as ready as I possibly could be, but I barely slept that night thinking about everything that could go wrong. The hearing started at 9 in the morning in a small courtroom with wood paneling and uncomfortable chairs. Judge Rita Dowling came in, and everyone stood up until she sat down behind the bench. She had gray hair pulled back in a bun and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Reagan sat at the other table with her attorney Clarence Bean, who wore an expensive suit and kept shuffling papers around. Giles presented our evidence first and walked Judge Dowling through everything we'd documented, including the videos of April responding to commands, the nursing notes about her voluntary movements, Quentin's formal evaluation showing 85% accuracy, and the timeline of Reagan's threats and harassment. He argued that I was a competent spouse and licensed physical therapist who understood April's condition and rehabilitation potential, that April was clearly showing cognitive function and voluntary control, and that Reagan's petition was based on outdated assumptions and personal bias. Judge Dowling asked several questions about April's prognosis and my caregiving plan, and I answered each one as clearly as I could while trying not to shake. Then Clarence Bean presented Reagan's side, arguing that I was overwhelmed and making emotional decisions instead of realistic ones, that April's movements were just reflexes being misinterpreted, and that Reagan was simply trying to protect both of us from financial ruin and false hope. Judge Dowling listened to everything and reviewed our evidence binders for what felt like forever, before she finally spoke. She said the evidence clearly showed that April had cognitive function and voluntary motor control, based on multiple documented observations and formal testing. She stated that I was acting as a reasonable advocate for my wife, and that there was no basis for psychiatric evaluation or immediate removal of my decision-making authority. She denied Reagan's request for emergency guardianship and the psych evaluation. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in weeks. But Judge Dowling wasn't done yet. She issued a temporary no-contact order preventing Reagan from visiting April during the acute recovery period. She said the documented pattern of harassment and April's physical stress responses during Reagan's visits were clear evidence that the contact was harmful to the patient's medical stability. Clarence Bean stood up and objected, saying Reagan had a right to see her daughter-in-law, but Judge Dowling cut him off. She said patient safety and medical stability took priority over family visitation rights, and the order would remain in place until further review. Reagan's face went completely red and she started whispering angrily to her attorney, but there was nothing they could do. Judge Dowling looked at both sides and said she was encouraging us to attempt mediation before any full guardianship hearing happened. She explained that family communication issues shouldn't be resolved through court intervention if a structured agreement was possible. She set a follow-up date for 30 days out to review our progress and see if mediation had helped resolve the conflict. Then she dismissed us and everyone stood up as she left the courtroom. I walked out feeling this weird mix of relief and exhaustion and anger that it had even gotten this far in the first place. 3 days later, the hospital transport team wheeled April down to the acute rehab unit on the 4th floor. I walked beside her gurney the entire way, holding her hand and watching her eyes track the ceiling tiles passing overhead. The rehab unit looked different from intensive care, with wider hallways, more natural light, and actual artwork on the walls instead of just medical equipment. They settled April into a private room that had windows facing east, and within an hour the rehab team started gathering for their first assessment. The speech therapist brought in a large laminated board covered with common words and phrases arranged in a grid pattern, and she explained how April could use eye movements to indicate what she wanted to communicate. She positioned the board at eye level and started the first trial, asking April to look at the word yes if she understood the instructions. April's eyes moved deliberately to the top left corner where yes was printed in large letters, and the therapist marked it down on her evaluation form. They went through basic needs next, with April indicating thirsty and tired and cold by shifting her gaze to each word when asked. The session lasted 30 minutes, and by the end, April had successfully communicated 12 different preferences, and the speech therapist documented it all as significant functional gain in her chart. I felt this surge of hope watching April interact with the board, seeing her personality come through in her choices, and knowing we had concrete proof she was still completely present inside her paralyzed body. The next morning, Giles called to confirm the mediation session was scheduled for that afternoon in a neutral conference room at a law office downtown. I spent 2 hours that morning organizing my evidence binders one more time, adding the new speech therapy documentation, and printing out photos of the communication board session. The mediator's office was in a bland corporate building with gray carpets and fluorescent lights, and we met in a windowless conference room with a long table and uncomfortable chairs. The facilitator was a middle-aged woman who introduced herself and immediately laid out strict ground rules about respectful communication, no interruptions, and focusing on solutions rather than blame. Reagan sat across from me with Clarence beside her, and I could see her jaw was tight and her hands were folded stiffly on the table. I started by presenting my documentation timeline, flipping through the binders and showing each instance of Reagan's harassment with dates, times, witness statements, and April's corresponding vital sign changes. The facilitator took notes and asked Reagan specific questions about each incident, and I watched Reagan's face get redder as she tried to explain away her behavior as concern rather than coercion. I showed the nursing staff statements describing April's tears and elevated heart rate during Reagan's visits, and the facilitator asked Reagan directly if she understood how her actions had caused measurable physical harm to the patient. Reagan started to argue, but Clarence put his hand on her arm and whispered something, and she went quiet. We took a 15-minute break, and I stepped outside to call the rehab unit and check on April, and the nurse told me she was resting comfortably and had used the communication board twice more that morning. When we reconvened, the facilitator asked both sides what outcomes we could accept, and I stated clearly that I needed Reagan to stop the guardianship petition and agree to supervised contact only when April explicitly consented. Reagan countered that she wanted regular updates about April's condition and the possibility of rebuilding the relationship once things stabilized, and Clarence drafted proposed terms on his legal pad. The mediation stretched past 4 hours with breaks for phone calls and private consultations, and by early evening we had a written agreement that Reagan would suspend the guardianship petition in exchange for structured monthly updates and supervised visits contingent on April's consent. Reagan signed the agreement with a tight signature and wouldn't look at me, and I signed it feeling both relieved and angry that it had required legal intervention to get her to stop attacking my wife. 2 days after the mediation, Valentina called to tell me the hospital's education department was scheduling mandatory training for medical staff on distinguishing reflexive responses from volitional movement. She explained they were using our case as a teaching example of why careful assessment matters and how cursory evaluations can lead to incorrect conclusions about patient capacity. I felt this weird satisfaction knowing that April's situation might actually help other patients and families in the future, that something good could come from all the fighting we'd had to do. The peer review committee sent me a formal letter the same week stating they had reviewed Lewis Waite's conduct and were recommending he complete continuing education on communication capacity assessment and patient-family dynamics in catastrophic injury cases. It wasn't a harsh punishment, but it was professional accountability, and I remember reading that letter 3 times just to make sure it was real, that someone had finally acknowledged his evaluation was inadequate and potentially harmful. The insurance case manager called on Friday with news that April's rehabilitation authorization was extended by 2 additional weeks, based on her documented functional gains. She listed the specific improvements that justified the extension, including improved head control, consistent communication via eye gaze, and emerging ability to trigger adaptive switches during therapy sessions. She told me that continued progress would support further extensions, and we'd reassess at the 2-week mark, and I thanked her multiple times before hanging up. That weekend, I met with an occupational therapist who specialized in home modifications, and we walked through our house room by room discussing what changes we'd need. She measured doorways for wheelchair access, evaluated the bathroom for grab bar placement and roll-in shower installation, identified where we'd put a hospital bed in the master bedroom, and listed out all the adaptive equipment we'd need for safe transfers. I took notes on everything and started building a detailed budget using our savings account balance. a small loan offer from my parents, and the projected insurance coverage for durable medical equipment. The numbers were scary but manageable if everything went according to plan, and I felt like I was finally doing something concrete to prepare for April coming home. On Monday afternoon, the speech therapist brought in a tablet with a simple eye tracking app installed, and April spent an hour practicing selecting words and phrases by looking at different areas of the screen. The technology wasn't perfect and sometimes registered the wrong selection, but April got better at it quickly, and by the end of the session, she was forming complete sentences. I asked her how she was feeling about everything, and she slowly was selected words to spell out, "proud of you," and then, "we will make it." And I started crying so hard I couldn't respond verbally. I just squeezed her hand and felt her squeeze back, and we sat there together in silence for several minutes while I pulled myself together. The mediation agreement got finalized that Wednesday, with signatures from both attorneys and a notary stamp making it legally binding. The terms were clear and specific, with Reagan accepting that I retained full decision-making authority, agreeing to supervised contact only when April explicitly consented through her communication methods, and signing prohibitions against harassment, threats, and interference with medical care decisions. In exchange, I agreed to send monthly written updates about April's medical status and rehabilitation progress through our attorneys, keeping Reagan informed without requiring direct contact. I filed the signed agreement with the court, and Judge Dowling's clerk confirmed it would be attached to the case record and enforced if either party violated the terms. That same week, I started applying for community grants for disability equipment and home modifications, filling out long applications that asked detailed questions about our financial situation and medical needs. The local foundation that supported families dealing with catastrophic injuries responded within 5 days, and the grant coordinator called to tell me we'd been approved for $8,000 in assistance. She walked me through how to use the funds for specific equipment purchases and contractor payments, and she helped me identify additional resources for respite care and caregiver support services. I thanked her about 10 times during that phone call, feeling this overwhelming gratitude that strangers were willing to help us navigate this impossible situation, and she told me that's exactly what the foundation existed for and wished us the best with April's recovery. 6 weeks after the accident, I walked back into my office for the first time since everything happened. My boss had set up a flexible schedule that let me work mornings while April had her rehab sessions, and when I got to my desk that first day, I found a card signed by everyone in the department. 3 of my coworkers had donated vacation hours to cover the time I'd missed, which meant I wouldn't lose my health insurance or take such a huge pay cut. I spent my lunch breaks calling April's rehab facility to check on her progress, and the therapist told me she was using her eye tracking device to participate in group sessions and communicate with staff. Work felt strange and normal at the same time, like I was living 2 separate lives that somehow fit together. 2 weeks after I started back, the therapist who'd been helping us set up the mediation meeting called to schedule the session with Reagan. I drove to her office on a Thursday afternoon and sat in the waiting room for 10 minutes before Reagan arrived. The therapist laid out the ground rules right away, explaining that all future communication would go through her office initially. Any visits with April required advance consent through the communication device, and violating these terms meant the no-contact order got put back in place immediately. Reagan looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that made me almost feel bad for her. She apologized for the first time ever, saying she'd been scared of losing me and handled everything wrong. I nodded but didn't say I forgave her because I honestly wasn't sure I could yet. The therapist wrote everything down and had us both sign the agreement, and Reagan left without trying to hug me or make excuses. That weekend, April got approved for a weekend pass from rehab, and I brought her home in the medical transport van we'd rented. Our house had the new ramp installed and grab bars in the bathroom, and I'd set up her communication device on a stand next to the couch. That evening, we sat together in the living room with the TV on low, and I asked her what she wanted for our future. April's eyes moved slowly across the screen, selecting words one at a time until she'd spelled out, "We stay together." I held her hand and promised her we absolutely would, no matter how hard things got. I was exhausted and scared and hopeful all at once, but I knew we were moving forward together, and that was what mattered most. And that's the end for now. Thanks for spending a little time here. It honestly makes telling these stories worthwhile. I hope you walk away feeling lighter than before. Subscribe if you'd like to keep the good energy going.